All right, welcome back to another episode of the HMG Podcast. We're trying to do something a little bit different today. We've actually got a studio this time around. We're going to work on getting our production quality a little bit higher than it has been recently and try to keep that going forward. If this is something you guys like and you want to see more of this, please do let us know. So I guess we'll start with a bit of a hobby update. Dan, what have you been working on recently?
So from where we are at the moment, I've just been finishing off the display board for my winter Bulgarians that's coming through. That's come up really nice, actually. So I've got to put the last final ground covers on that. Hopefully I'll get a photo of that to put in the information for this one here. And then I moved from that into the first unit of infantry, 10 riflemen, and applied the primers on that, getting ready to do the airbrushing as we move forward with that. So it should give me a nice gradient on the cloaks. And then that would be probably the next goal, is get those 10 done. And how quickly I get those done while trying to be a dad will be a question, but yeah.
Well, I'm not a dad, so I did plenty of painting, and I think I finished an entire Fallschirmjäger force during the week leading up to the event that we're going to be talking about in this episode, and that's going to be the Varsity Pathfinders. So it was roughly between 30 and 40 Fallschirmjäger infantry, all the camo and that kind of stuff. And then just prior to that, I painted up all of the 148 tactics stuff because we did a demo day probably a week prior to the event that we're going to be talking about today. So yeah, been busy painting. And then us, again, COVID is just not really a big issue here in WA. So we are gaming every single weekend, which is really lucky. Yeah. And the club's basically going on fire here in Perth. We have events. We're doing a lot of naval stuff with Cruel Seas. We're doing a lot of infantry combat. Either that's bolt action or it's 148 tactic mostly. And yeah, we've got a few other things in the pipeline. Some people are playing a bit of Alpha Strike Battletech. And we're looking at a whole bunch of systems. So hobby has been full go for us for 3 months now, something like that.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. And no shortage of upcoming events in Perth itself. Obviously, we do a lot of stuff, but some of the other clubs are starting to pick up and host some big tournaments and this kind of stuff later to the end of the year. But how about we get all into it? So just so you know, Gotchin's over here. This is Dan, and I'm Jacob. We're the Historical Miniature Wargamers podcast. We primarily focus on bolt action, but we're all interested in all kinds of other miniature games.
Some would say too many.
If it's historical, we pretty much play it. But, although we're historical in name, we're not afraid of, trying some fantasy and sci-fi and that kind of thing from time to time. But World War II seems to be the thing that brings us all together. Yeah. And bolt action specifically is how we all met each other as well. Yeah. The last event that we would have played would have been Gotchin's Varsity Pathfinders.
Yeah, so we just started a 3-game system campaign at RHG. So we wanted to have 3 game days, 3 systems, 1 system, 1 day. And so what we did to start the campaign, which was based around Operation Varsity. It was a very late war Allied invasion into Germany. It was a combined airborne and amphibious over the Rhine. So this is actually the 3rd combat jump that Allied paratroopers were actually capable of doing. Most people who are into World War II and ground combat specifically have seen Band of Brothers. Mm-hmm. And if you remember, there's a bit sort of halfway through the miniseries, a little bit later, Winters tells Nixon or asks him about Operation Varsity, and he's like, "Oh, you're one of the few paratroopers who's got 3 combat jumps, or he's got the 3rd star." In his wings. And that episode that's around that was Operation Varsity. So it was historically it's been criticized as an overcompensation for the failure of Market Garden. Mm-hmm. They broke a lot of the rules that everybody had sort of agreed that you don't do when it comes to airborne drops specifically. So it was low speed, low altitude, broad daylight, clear skies, airborne drop into the defended positions. So when you think about the invasion of Normandy, there was a lot of other things that were going on, and Admittedly, it wasn't a very well organized drop. It was a lot of scattering and stuff like that. But the actual casualties from the airborne operation, specifically the drop, was, for all intents and purposes, percentage quite low. It was actually pretty harmless. And if you've looked at some sort of studies about, say, for example, Rommel's asparagus, I think there was a total of 3 gliders that were affected by it. It was, and so, don't get me wrong, it was extremely chaotic because it was still really dangerous, but by and large, it was quite safe for a combat operation. Market Garden was sort of the same thing. They didn't actually do a combat drop. And same in... It was sort of a combat drop, not really, depending on your drop zone and things like that. But the landing, by and large, for Market Garden was again very low stress. Normandy, you weren't dropping onto fortified positions. You were dropping into sort of, ideally, your drop zones were areas that were behind enemy lines but weren't actually garrisoned by troops at the time. Sort of empty fields, empty farmyards, that sort of thing. So you could coalesce into an effective force and then go and proceed onto your objectives. Whereas Varsity was none of that. It was literally low speed airdrops right on top of enemy positions.
Right.
And it was complete chaos.
Ballsy.
Yeah. And so there was this really interesting thing where at that point in the war, the German forces were naturally facing a lot of desertion, a lot of attrition, but they actually ended up having a higher concentration of war materiel. So not necessarily things like tanks. They were precious supply always for the Wehrmacht, and a lot of motorization was also a precious supply. But there were so many AA guns and anti-tank guns that didn't have crews. And so infantry battalions ended up basically becoming anti-tank gun battalions just because during their retreat eastwards, they scooped them all up. And so you put those two things together and you get a massive casualty rate on combat drops. And it was, strategically, perhaps not the smartest thing you could have done. And the other thing that was different is they did it simultaneously with the amphibious assault. So in Normandy, for example, that Operation Overlord, they dropped the paratroopers the night before to coalesce, and then they were supposed to have completed their objectives before or during the naval bombardment before the landings, which this is different. Everything at the same time. And so we're going to try to recreate that in the final day. So the first event that we started off with was Pathfinders. So this was a firefight event. What we were trying to capture was different objectives that Pathfinder units might be trying to perform in leading up to an invasion or shoring up the defenses, depending on which side you were on. So the first mission that we played was basically a bomb plant mission. If you've played sort of Counter-Strike Demolition, that's how that works. You've got a secret bomb carrier. Your opponent's got a secret bomb carrier. Your bomb site is designated an air deployment zone. You had to go over there and basically pass a rally order to plant the bomb. It was intended to be quite difficult because it was supposed to capture either Allied Pathfinders destroying specific key structures to make an invasion easier, or fortifications that you needed sort of controlled demolition for. It wasn't them lobbing a satchel grenade onto an AA gun or something like that. And for the Axis defenders, what I was trying to capture there was them, strategically destroying bridges, so the Allied couldn't use them to cross the Rhine. And so that was actually the mission sort of played out how I'd hoped, which is sort of what you can always hope for when you design a mission. I'd made the bomb plant quite difficult and slow, so you'd have to be on the site, and then your next turn would have to be a rally order, and then the turn after it explodes. And the reason is when you're doing something like that, again, it's not something you can throw up and do. I wanted to encourage players to secure that area and plant it, and that also means you can't just put 11 of your 12 firefight guys on the defense, sprint in with smoke grenades, throw the satchel charge and run away. I wanted to force players to make the decision between attacking and defending.
And that turned to be quite a pivotal thing with the missions. So one of the issues, but one of the things that comes up in the demolition game within Bolt Action mainly is that it's actually too quick to kill that and destroy that objective by a unit getting on it. So by actually just putting a couple of extra steps in there to go, it's going to require you not just to run in there and touch it and, yay, I win, but you actually need to hold that area and hold that for what in game terms a significantly long length of time. In firefight, especially because each man acts individually. Just because the bomb carrier gets there by himself, that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have a squad to hide in. It doesn't have anything like that. So you need the support to get in, or at least to clear the ground off before he runs up, which was quite good. Yeah. Quite interesting when I was witnessing that one.
So this mission is very reminiscent of Counter-Strike, and to sort of put that in perspective, we've said the word firefight a few times, but just so you know what it is, it's basically the skirmish version of Bolt Action. You're activating individual soldiers rather than squads. So each order device goes to each individual infantry soldier. Episode 2, I think we did a whole talk on what firefight is like in running at a previous event. This again is a second firefight event for us. But I think specifically that mission was the one I was most excited to play. And that really would make sense in something where you have single infantry figures rather than like an engineer squad would be responsible for destroying that site and that kind of thing. So that was mission 1. How many did we have in the pack?
It was originally going to be a 4-mission day, but the last one was just going to be a media engagement. It was it was going to be used to, if there was any issues with if all of the sides sort of scored evenly and it was a net draw, then the meeting engagement would be a great place to use as a tiebreaker, because you can score so many potential victory points, especially in firefight.
Yeah.
So what I was doing for the campaign was I was going to take the aggregate Allied and Axis result per each mission and use that to decide the consequences of the campaign. So what we had for that mission 1 was actually a pretty resounding Axis victory. So what that means is for the Varsity campaign day is that the Allied bridge, the bridgehead that the Allies were going to use to cross, is completely destroyed, which means they have to execute a river crossing into an entrenched position, which is more or less what happened.
Yeah.
Okay. And how will that play in the game? Is that just like an advance over, or?
Yeah, so I've used it so you have to have enough movement to cross the river.
Yeah.
So, if you're a tank unit, you've got to be up against it. The river's about 4 or 5 inches wide.
Okay.
It's a little bit wider, it's a little bit narrower. So if your infantry unit's up against it, you can hop over, but you can't sort of shoot once you cross it. Because you're too busy stowing your equipment.
It's basically a run at half speed. That's what they have to commit to do that.
But say, for example, if you've got the run, and you can start 6 inches away and you can still cross the river with it. So the idea is, if you're in sort of a covered position, you can still sort of sprint out in the open across the field, because otherwise it becomes a straight up slaughter. You have to position yourself in front of the river for a turn and then try to cross it.
Without any cover.
And it's not so the actual area just in front of the river is in cover, but the area behind it, you've got some hills and some line of sight leading up to trench position. So what I envisage is that player is going to bring a fair amount of heavy guns, going to find a particular point and try to break through that point, because that's what you would do. You'd find the weakest point in the line and you'd force it.
So we'll chuck up a bunch of photos, because Gorchin made 3 boards for this entire event, right?
It's 2 6x4s.
Right. And you've
look
got
awesome.
there's a river crossing, then there's a
big forest section
that has a kind of fire base.
Yeah, and then there's a town at the other end, and there's a main supply route or a road that runs through it.
And these tables will be connected, but with other players on various tiles, I guess.
It's going to be roughly about 4x4, so 4 foot by 4 foot per player pair, but there's not going to be any borders between the players. If they want to operate in each other's space, they absolutely can do it. And that's to sort of try to capture what a military operation's like. You've got rough area of operations and your own responsibilities, but if you see an exposed flank, it's up to you
take
to
the
secure
opportunity.
Yeah. So say the middle table itself, which might have player 3 and 4, either of those forces can go to either side and help their other ally, I guess. Yeah.
And so I'm trying to remember now what mission 2 was. For that one.
So wasn't mission 2
King
of the Hill?
Yeah.
Yes.
King of the Hill? Because I got a story about what happened in King of the Hill.
So the intent of the King of the Hill is have more units within 3 inches of the center of the board than your opponent. And so what that was trying to capture was either paratroopers securing a drop zone, or it was the Axis players preventing them from securing a drop zone, or conversely, allies setting up sort of artillery calculations, because a lot of times in World War II, you would set up where you are, you'd spend your time doing your computational sort of distance and direction of known enemy positions from your current position, and you would supply that to nearby artillery units. So it might be mortars, it might be artillery cannons, or it could be sort of self-propelled guns. And that was sort of the idea there, that you've either got Allied or Axis commanders, local commanders setting up firing positions or fire bases. And so that was what I was trying to capture there. And Dan, I feel very
oh man, that table.
very interested about your choice of tactics.
So,
That one.
so before I get into that aspect, I actually played one of the 2 new players that we had for that particular event, and unfortunately, and I really apologise, I can't recall your name. I'm sure we'll find that out and we'll put that in the comment. But we had one of these new players start with us, and so I don't think he'd actually played Bolt Action really before, and he'd only had one firefight game, which was round 1.
Yeah.
So considering my experience,
He did win that game.
Sort of we hadn't got there yet, and I wasn't overconfident, but I did say to him, I was like, I appreciate you haven't played firefight before, and so some of these things might be new for you. Let's use this as a game that, whilst I'll still play to win, like I'm not going to give you a free ride, but let's use this to explore some of the ideas and things that, you want to learn more about while we play the game. So we took probably a more casual approach overall to the game, even though it was part of an event. But I did that so that I could get another player skilled up and understanding of how Bolt Action works and how Firefight works, and also not to be just that one player that rocks up and goes, "Oh, a bunny."
Oh my god!
And because that's happened before to me, where you play someone that's really experienced and you go, "I'm sort of just learning how to," and they hit you with a sledgehammer, and you're like,
that's not
I didn't think that'd be fun for him, especially if he'd only literally just played his first game. So I went in there and helped him a bit. We covered a number of variety of things that hadn't been covered in the previous game that just didn't come up, but one of those was smoke grenades. Now smoke grenades are, I would think it'd be fair to say, acknowledged within the community within Firefight. They are quite advantageous. They don't scatter, they block line of sight, they offer cover, and you have an unlimited supply of them. That's probably one of the key aspects that's a bit of a problem.
Another key is that normally smoke, you're using an artillery officer or a mortar.
Yes.
Every infantry model has smoke grenade equipped.
Yep.
Yeah.
Currently by default. And at the moment, we haven't toyed with changing or removing that, possibly after what I did to show the effect.
Yes.
Which I've talked to other players and they've done it too and would agree, but maybe we'll look at tweaking that a little bit. But essentially, as we get down the board towards King of the Hill, and our hill ironically was roughly centered, so that was great. I still measured it out and went, I should have just left the marker where it was. Gorchin already did that. And my right flank essentially stalled a little bit, but I deployed all my troops in pairs of 2. And so the idea being that even if one guy moves forward and gets stalled, I have someone ready to support straight away. And then within 12 inches, I'd have another pair of 2. And basically that was my entire battle plan the whole way along, because I took an officer and then riflemen to fill 200 points. And so it was something like 15 riflemen and an officer. And so that all went dandy and went fine. But once I'd actually got my right flank to sort of engage a bit, and the new player was a little bit cautious, had some building, so he really had the advantage on that flank. I looked at my left, and he was on the other side of a crest of a hill in the middle, and I was coming up to that, and I was like, we're going to fight over that. I know we're going to fight over that. So I really only have my left flank to work with, and I was stuck in woods. And I'm going, so my one flank that I need to maneuver is stuck in rough ground, and I'm like, okay, I'm not just going to be able to run through or around these things. I want to get some sort of cover. And so I started a process of just throwing smoke grenades. And my original intent was just to simply throw smoke grenades to provide some cover and restrict those fire lanes down in a way that I could cover majority of my force moving up. What made it worse, because that was pretty fair at that point, and he even threw one smoke grenade, so we had 4 smoke grenades that had been thrown at the end of that first round. And at that point, it's probably not that bad, right? Because you've only had some go out. There's the possibility it'll disappear or scatter. It didn't, stayed exactly where it was. And for those that want to, it's a 50-50 chance that it will stay versus do something else. So I then got the dice because I had more models that were on the table. I then activated my NCO to snap 2 and my entire mid to left flank. Essentially, all of them took a step forward and threw another smoke grenade.
Yeah.
And so I remember it was about this point after I'd placed, I think I was about halfway through putting the smoke markers down, where Jacob, his game's already finished, and he walks out and he goes, "What are you doing?"
Yeah.
I'm just smoking. And I was just putting smoke markers down, and I basically had a line. It was 1, 2, 3, 4. It was about 7 smoke grenades off the second salvo that I'd thrown, which that's about 21 inches worth of smoke that just covered essentially my entire flank.
Yeah.
And all of my
like
guys.
to point out that this is when I gave you the 15-minute warning for the round.
Yes, yeah, we had taken a bit of time, but and essentially we were in turn. I think we were in turn 4 by that point after the moving through and advancing and stuff. But this smoke wall's gone down, and this poor new player is like just looking at me like a deer in the headlights, going,
"What do I do?
How do I even engage with that? Like I don't even like I can't just run through it because I'm only running with a single dude at that point, and anyone that you've got that hasn't activated is just going to be able to take him out before I do anything. Maybe if I get everyone through the smoke, but then they've run through the smoke, so they can't actually do anything because there was I think it was 7 inches between his models and where the smoke line was, and because they didn't scatter, I was able to essentially mathematic out exactly that distance. So I knew that he wouldn't be able to advance and take a shot. So that was a little bit gamey on my part. I knew we'd have to commit to runs.
You just wanted to see how this would work, right?
Oh, I've known how it works. It doesn't normally work this well in regular BA because smoke scatters and you only get the hit on the 6.
Yeah.
When you can deliberately place that smoke, and I will state, like I said, it was a little bit gaming of me. When you deliberately take the opportunity to leverage distances in the rules, it's not always necessarily bad. This case was borderline. And anyway, so this gent's like, I don't know what to do. And I'm like, well, let's just take a step back because arguably if you can't do anything right now, I'm going to win the mission. Because even if the smoke disappears, I'm going to have more guys that step up on the hill because I've got these 6 that can all run onto it. And so you literally won't have 6 models that are in space to be able to do it and not get fought back. But I went, let's just take half a moment at the end of this turn, and we're sort of running low on time. It was coming in towards turn 5, I was like, let's have a look at what actually would matter. And as I turned and looked at the center of the board, one of the things that I had done was when I moved that mid-left flank across to try and drop that smoke so I wouldn't get engaged and protect that flank, which worked beautifully, I'd moved probably 2 more models across to the left from the middle than what I should have. Because when we started looking across on the hill, it was much more of a 1-to-1 advantage, as opposed to where I had previously the superiority of a couple of extra models to go clean up, which by pure numbers would mean I would generally have 1 model left if we killed each other for 50-50 each way. And I disrupted the status quo by pulling those 2 across. And so then I was looking at the board and I went, I'm going to hate myself for doing this, but I was like, you can win this turn, right? And he's like, what? And I was like, well... And he started the wheels turning about using a 12-inch run to do an assault. And I was like, the trick you're going to have is whether your models can actually see my models on the other side of the hill. If you can, I think you're actually, you've got a shot to do it. And if your only other alternative is losing, you may as well go for the win on this turn. Because if you do kill what's there, I won't have anything to come back to out you. And so the initiative would change over. And so we went through and looked at it and we obviously didn't pre-measure, but right, this guy's probably needing to go there, probably needing to go here, and we agreed on what we thought the best order would be of doing those actions. And if any of these fail before the last one, it's not going to matter. I'll get the win. It's fine. And so we went through the first action, and he slaughtered that guy. We went to the second action, and he slaughtered that guy.
Perfect.
And so now I went. So even though his models, he's got 2 that are consolidated onto the objective, there was the possibility I could shoot one of them off and end up still with a 1-to-1 tie. So he really needed to kill off my 3rd guy. So in theory, if he failed his assault, that means I get a free consolidate I would then get either a shooting attack or an assault for that unit's activation, which hadn't gone yet.
Yeah.
And so I was like, it's not going to be an assault because I'll be able to move on to the objective. It will be a point blank twos to kill with a submachine gun. I'm like, I'm pretty confident I could nail that guy. And he slaughtered the third guy. Yeah. So he went from having his left flank, his right flank essentially in a stalemate. My right flank in a stalemate. My left flank essentially secured and going, you can't touch this because we're all smoking. Just the smoke template's not the smoking. And then I'd lost the center in a matter of dice rolls, and I just went 3
activations. It was done.
I was like, okay, well, not much I can do about that. So good game.
We played that city table with the King of the Hill.
Yeah, that was
very intense. And the thing that I really liked about this King of the Hill is the actual deployment that we did.
Yeah.
So I don't know how best to explain it, but like
you basically
12 inches away from the hill.
Yeah, you set your objective mark in the center of the board.
Yeah.
It's got a little 3-inch capture zone around it, and then you put all of your units' dice into a bag.
Yeah.
Dice bag. You pull a unit out, and then that must be 12 inches away. The first unit must be 12 inches away from the center. Actually, each one has to be 12 inches away from the center, and they also have to be
12 inches away from each other.
From an enemy model.
Yep.
And so what ended up happening, I think in your case, Dan, you pretty much like deployed almost normally.
Yes.
You had your side,
Yes,
he
I
had
did.
his side.
Yeah.
What happened for me was there was a great, so my army that I brought was basically modeled after a standard 12-man paratrooper section.
Mm-hmm.
You've got an LMG in there, which I took as an MMG. So I had those 3 guys. I had a second lieutenant because I needed one, and then I had 8 bodies, an NCO and 7 guys to fill in the slots. I took an extra BAR because late war. Sorry, I took 1 BAR because late war paratroopers actually were given BARs, which you can see in Market Garden as well. But yeah, so I had an MMG team, 9 guys, and my second lieutenant. So what I did was I put my MMG team, I managed to get the first dice, and I put the gunner in like the second story building, and he could see
the whole objective.
Like the whole town. And he was just looking right at the objective. And then I decided from that point, I was like, well, why don't I just try to use generally the tactics that are in there? You'll have an assault section. For any given US squad, you have an assault section, you've got your base of fire section. So I deployed around another like 4 or 5 guys around the MMG building, around the base outside on the base floor, looking at sort of setting a perimeter. And then I set another 5 or 6 guys off in the opposite corner, and you sort of filled that ribbon of space between the two with your
When I was looking at that, like I was trying to play the game that you do when you're doing forward deployment, where you're trying to deny points of deployment by placing your figure there. Then it's 12 inches safe on this side and that side. So my stuff was really scattered across the board as much as possible to prevent you from sneaking up behind me, I guess. But that meant you had 2 strong points with all your stuff.
And that was the intent. I wanted 1 around my NCO, 1 around my lieutenant. So if I needed to, I could sort of seize an opportunity and rush through.
And typically in a regular game of Bolt Action, machine guns aren't that strong. In this, they're pretty good because of the multi-shot rule.
Yeah.
And then
I would go beyond pretty good to say they're actually pretty amazing.
Well, unexpectedly good. Like I did not, typically you're getting shot by an MMG, you take a pin, maybe you get a casualty, and that's it. In this one, and that's what I took it at the first, until I saw it, I think it knocked out like a guy straight up.
So you moved across the street, and my MMG could see both of them, and I was like, "Yeah, I'm going to shoot." And I just opened up with my MMG, and I just hosed everybody.
Yeah. So as I've been saying, you just didn't expect that it would inflict enough damage. So for just so you know, I think I was maybe the only player that just took all vet, and then doubled down with that ARs as well. Typically machine gun doesn't do too much. It's nice for pinning and a distraction, but it became the focal point of the lethality of your list. So for the next 3 to 4 turns, my focus was on either grenading the building that they were in or putting smoke in front of it so it wouldn't be able to shoot my soldiers. but that gave you kind of free reign with everything else because there was 2, 3, 4 activations wasted on trying to take out this MMG.
Yeah.
And he didn't die in the end of it. I think he ran onto the capture point right at the end, which we were kind of contested with a few different guys.
And
yeah.
it was crazy because on the capture point, it ended up just being a last minute 1-for-1.
Yeah.
Every time you'd throw somebody in, I'd either kill him and replace him, or I'd die trying to kill him. And so it was just this back and forward 1-for-1 under the point as that force sort of swept in, and the one in the corner was busy trying to keep the machine gun safe while he was just hosing as many FJs as he could. And then it came to the last turn, and we were like even on the point. It was the last dice, and I just like
he can run there.
MMG just like Lafayette mount up with his loader, machine gun on his shoulder, just sprinted off the point.
Oh, wow.
I'm out of ammo. This has never happened before.
So this battle it was my introduction to using smoke for firefight, which I hadn't used previously, and I thought that we used it to a level that would be expected for the actual combat theme and that kind of thing. Yeah, you'd want to smoke out a machine gun and this kind of stuff, and then I see your table. It's just this complete line.
I think you used it you'd block off a street so I can shoot your guys as they moved on the objective. That's exactly how you'd use smoke.
Sensibly rather than tyrannically. But,
so that was an amazing mission. I like that one a lot more than I thought, and I think the deployment and the way that we played it with your two kind of fire bases and then my scatter, like I don't think necessarily either was wrong. And I think it was quite a fun matchup.
That was actually one of Dan's designs. It was also in Raiding Party King of the Hill.
Right.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time confirming with players and obviously working with the mechanics of the game to understand what would be good and interesting. The raiding party missions were actually really solid. So.
And that was mission 3.
Yeah.
So I really liked the night raid. This was sort of the VIP capture the officer, capture the NCO. If you want to see details about that, you can check out our raiding party episode.
Yeah.
But I was like, I have an opportunity to run another firefight event. Night raid absolutely needs to make an appearance.
Yep.
It's just it's too much chaos and it's too much fun. It has to be played.
And I need to change my entire tactics for this. So last time, the two things that I felt that really hindered me. The large inexperienced troops just didn't work out for me in that game. I've actually rethought on that a couple of times and still think perhaps they just didn't play out the way I wanted it to in the last event, but there are definitely some bonuses for
sure
for taking inexperience, particularly in firefight. So I did the reverse. I'm like, okay, I'm going to play all veteran and do the ARs and all that kind of stuff. And this time I'm not going to put all my officers on. So the board is quartered, 4 quadrants. I can't remember exactly how, but basically you choose one player chooses one quadrant and then you have the opposite one. So last time I did, the aim of the mission is that you want to capture their NCO or their lieutenant. And you're penalized for killing them. So last time I was like, yeah, sure, I'll just chuck them up in the middle. They can be in a great position to then shoot the opponent.
And you capture them by assault.
But you get captured by assault.
Them by an assault.
I played Brad last time and this time. So
there's really no excuses here, Jacob.
Last time I did right on the line, and he captured my stuff like turn 1.
Because he got the dice.
Yeah,
and so he simply went, "Oh look, that's the game-winning objective," and just went and took you out.
So that was what was the event called? Episode 2, the previous
raiding party.
Raiding party. Yeah. So that was raiding party, but this time I deployed a little bit more carefully.
I'm glad you learned.
And we did a few strategic smokes, not a ridiculous amount. There was a lot of terrain in between. It was just like wooded stuff, and we played it as dense. And a lot of us were not exactly within the tree line. So behind it, so then they wouldn't actually be shot. And there was a little bit of playful
cat and mouse.
Cat and mouse. But we got really aggressive near the end, and there was a lot of assaulting and just some unexpected bad results for Brad, unfortunately. And you know, we had NCOs charging other NCOs that were also, you know, escorting an enemy officer or something like this. And
you stay there. I gotta go get your buddy and beat him up, and then you are both going to be subjected to me. Understand?
and there's a lot of time between Brad's turns where he's like, "I'm just gonna kill your NCO. Like, I'm just gonna shoot him. I'm just angry. like I don't care anymore. I just want to cause casualties so you can't win." Well, you know. Anyway,
Did you guys draw in the end?
We misplayed a turn or
Okay.
two of dice, and that was related to the assaulting
Yeah.
mechanics and stuff. So I think it's either I came out with a victory or I drew.
Okay.
I can't exactly remember, but there was a point where it's like, oh, Jacob's clearly won, and then we have to replay a few bits and pieces. But like that mission,
Yeah, it's another good one.
I did a lot better this time.
It's probably worth mentioning as well that that mission is definitely not a competitively balanced
Yeah.
mission in the sense of, you know, both sides are equal in setting up and stuff, because it gives a lot of control to the players on how they deploy the stuff originally. And unfortunately, for example, like the first time you ran it, if you make a mistake in that deployment, it can backfire really quickly. So there is a little bit of player ability that comes into it, and that always skews balance to a degree, right? But the intent is that it is fun, it is chaotic, and it's something to be taken with a little bit more of a lighthearted approach. It's a lot easier to do that in Firefight than regular bolt action. Not to say that I haven't toyed with it in regular bolt action.
So mission 1, we had an overall Axis victory.
Yeah, mission 2 was
Allies.
No, mission 2 was also an overall Axis victory.
Oh, really?
So Axis more or less resoundingly won the day. The Allies came back and won mission 3 with the night raid.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so what those 3 consequences mean is because the Axis were able to destroy all of their objectives, basically plant the bomb, the bridge was destroyed. None of the Allied players were able to do that, which means there's an asparagus zone that a glider has to land through now, which will be an incredible experience for all people aboard. And then because the Axis controlled the center of the board for all of them, they were able to set up a fire zone, basically a pre-calculated fire base. But that's going to work for whoever has artillery units in their Axis or Allied will get the advantage. Yeah. And because they prevented Allied Pathfinders from placing a Eureka beacon, there's going to be no beacon to guide the paratroopers, which will be an issue for them as well.
So that will add some scatter into their deployment, I guess. Yeah.
This sounds pretty historic so far.
Yeah.
And finally, because the Allies won the night raid, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to provide the Allied players a sanitized and stylized list that the Axis players will be using. So I'm getting all of the lists submitted the week before.
Yeah.
So obviously the Allied players all on one side, the Axis players on the other side. But now because the Allied players have captured sort of key officers and some intel, I'm going to be providing, it's not going to be a Tiger with this particular upgrade at this particular point. It's just going to be expect a heavy armored platoon, expect a light armored platoon, expect mixed infantry with support weapons.
But that'll give the Allied generals a chance to go, right, well, we know that you've got a bit more better anti-tank capability, so you're going to sit on this flank to counter those threats, and so it should play out
to
at
make
a
that
strategic
clear,
level.
the Allies can't react and change their lists.
Correct.
They're already proposed and submitted and all that kind of stuff.
What I wanted to capture there was if you're a general on one of these fronts, you don't suddenly have other units you can rebuild your army with. Right? You have the units that you have that are combat ready, that are not combat ready. You, as was the case of Varsity, you might want to airdrop more units, but you don't have enough planes.
Yeah.
Those are all things that you are out of your control. What is in your control is the objectives that you give and how you assign support elements. So I will, I'm going to allow the Allied players to sort of shuffle who is attacking from who's deploying in which area, but I'm not going to let them change their lists.
Yep.
Will they know who their opponent is and what list they have?
They're not going to know who the actual player is.
Okay.
Player style is a big thing. So
Yeah.
knowing which general's commanding which forces is actually quite an important key piece of military intelligence.
Yeah.
If you've studied your
Yeah.
military opponents. And same in Bolt Action. A lot of these guys, the community's only so big.
Yeah,
Everybody's
yeah.
got a rough idea of how those people play, but they will know which axis platoon is holding which objective,
Yeah.
or
Okay.
is maneuvering onto which objective.
Right.
So that will give them, I guess, a plausible amount of strategic flexibility, but not weigh it massively, so they can
Yeah.
rebuild their list to counter them. Because
And-
that's no fun.
And that's how you designed a lot of those rewards and consequences. Is it's meant to be, it's an assisting tool. It's not necessarily an outright advantage in, in then determining the outcomes of the battles. But it is meant to be, if you spend a little bit of time thinking about this, you are going to be better prepared for what's actually going to happen.
Yeah.
And so that should lead to it'll still be a good game regardless,
Yeah.
but it should lead to a slightly better advantage. Now, of course, the Allies are going to have their gliders run into the asparagus and have the wings torn off, but that's a different story.
Yeah, and that was the intent. I didn't want the players on the final day to feel like the game was decided before they got there.
Yeah.
I wanted them to go, I have to think about this differently.
Yeah.
There's some advantages that I have, there's some advantages that they have, and I need to leverage mine while trying to prevent them from leveraging theirs, or aim to really press on the disadvantages that they've got.
So that was Varsity Pathfinders. We have
then one,
another
yep.
following up event that we'll talk about next time, which will be the Wings of Glory event, Scramble. Is it?
Scramble, battle. It's going to be basically a fight for
Yeah.
air supremacy.
So those that don't know, Wings of Glory is just an aerial aviation World War II game. We've got a couple of videos about how to play it. It is very simple and easy to learn.
And super fun.
Yeah, it is. It is an awesome game. So we'll go into that next time. Is there anything else that we wanted to touch on?
Probably we can move into, I think, the next stage we're going to look at, which is where I do a lot of talking, and hopefully you will learn a lot. So this is another one of the, I guess, mechanics or tactics articles that I've been working through and writing and trying to strategize out. Admittedly, I've been stalled a little bit as a dad with my little daughter being born in January, so things have taken a little bit longer to get going again. But this part's on angles of attack. So when I say angles of attack, what that really means is the best approach, or specifically the approach vector, to engage the enemy. Now, this is scalable, so it applies to unit combat, in firefight, at the platoon level when you start up a battle, or even if you're going to a company level or brigade level, like I played with Nick a couple of weeks ago. And it's looking at the terrain and the board, your enemy's positions and their defenses, and going, is it best for me to get there as soon as possible and directly engage? So by use of just a perpendicular, straightforward attack. Do I need to maneuver a little bit around the terrain? So I have to sacrifice a little bit of time, but I'll be better prepared for going in on the attack. So it's more of an oblique angle. Or do I need to, there's an obstacle or there's something else in the way, or my enemy, for example, is weak on the flank. So I'm going to spend a larger amount of time maneuvering to get to a parallel line of attack. And the parallel line of attack is generally, in military history throughout the centuries, will prove that a flanking attack is generally one of the best attacks that you can provide. Essentially inferior only to a rearguard attack. Being attacked from behind is never pleasant in that space, but it's very hard to get to that position unless something else has gone wrong, or you've sneakily done something and you pop up behind them. A lot
Or
of
you
this,
power dropped.
or you para dropped, although while you para drop, you're also vulnerable. So there's parts of that, but so that's I guess the generic principles behind what these are. And so we'll start with the easiest one, which is a straight-on head-on attack or a perpendicular attack. Now, it's important to understand that because it is scalable, it does depend on the unit types you've got. If you have 15 bamboo spearmen directly in front of you, 11 inches away, you know that they're probably going to launch a perpendicular
Yeah.
straight on
Yeah,
attack
yeah,
at you, right?
definitely.
Like they're
Yeah.
going to just charge you next turn. So that means that perpendicular attacks often, depending on if the unit types are generally favoring that sort of an attack, they're very predictable. And so you certainly won't be doing any sleight of hand movements to confuse your enemy when your tiger tank rolls forward to make sure it's within that 12 inches as quickly as possible to trigger tiger fear. Most opponents I would consider would see that coming and would try to be, it's more about getting their anti-tank threats to that tiger as quickly as possible. They might be coming through a different route, but in terms of it, it's the most direct route, therefore it's your fastest engagement time. Now that's important because in order to get a strong breakthrough or a follow-up for a breakthrough, you need to have the most time possible left within the game itself for that unit to do something after it's achieved its first task.
You need exploitation time.
That's right. Yeah. Because it's all great if you finally break through, but it's turn 6 and you can't impact the rest of the battle. And if you were stuck there from turn 2, buy some new dice. That's a long time to be stuck.
I find crushing one with the hammer while the rest of them watch helps a lot.
Yes, yeah. Microwave ovens have been mentioned. Grillers work pretty good.
And throw them in the ocean if they're no good.
Well, and you know what? If they do just need to be replaced, I picked up some Dice of War dice. They're really nice.
Yeah.
They're really,
Fantastic.
really
Yeah,
nice
I got
dice.
some as well.
So I appreciate that for Dice of War. When I put that order through, they have come up schmick. They look really good. But because it's very predictable, it means that you often you can't just send them in by themselves. You need something to support. You need a unit nearby, a unit of any sort of type. So if you're sending a tank forward, it generally performs better when you have infantry to support it alongside because you're going to have anti-tank threats, mobile anti-tank threats that are trying to counter your movement. Because normally when you're deploying, you deploy the tank away from any fixed anti-tank, if you can. But your infantry need to support that tank because if they're coming after you with bazookas, Panzer Shreks, Panzer Faust, all those fun things, flamethrowers, your infantry needs to either present a better target, which is actually normally what happens with a flamethrower. They go, I could kill the infantry instead, and your tank goes, yes, kill the infantry, yes. But you can't just, if you leave it in there by itself, and it's quite a predictable move for it. And a lot of, it's also known, if you go by video game referencing, there's a point and click armies where you essentially go, that unit's going to go kill that, and you just let it do its thing. But rarely do you let it do its thing and then ignore it for the rest of the game. Yeah. They are actually quite a good distraction tactic because a perpendicular attack and deliberately forcing an attack directly forward, it's the fastest engagement, which means it puts the most pressure on your opponent because they have less time to think, they have less time to go through that OODA loop. But it's also, if it's a fairly big, scary threat in the terms of bolt action, like if it is a squad of 15 bamboo spearmen, you're not really just going to get to let them do its thing. Like your opponent, like if someone throws spearmen at me, I'm like, I hate the fact that I know how the psychology thing works, but I really want to deal with that unit. I really do. I just do not want them anywhere near me at all.
And for reference, what kind of points level are we thinking of a bamboo spearman of 15 men? Like, because I think they would take some kind of subtraction from the points for not having a firearm.
Yeah,
but you probably take them as vets as well, and it might end up equaling down to 10 points a model or something like that. But
I think it'd be fair to say they're between 150 to 200 points as a generic sort of block for 15. Yeah. But I also know that we had one of our players very, very early on when I started up the Bolt Action events, he brought a Japanese army, which was it was dual artillery pieces and 120 bamboo spearmen.
Oh yeah.
Now, yes, internet, yes, I know, but I can just imagine people railing at that, or people going, "I love it."
Good on him. They're expensive. 10 metal models for like $40 or something.
The reality was, I think some of them were proxied, to be fair.
Yeah,
but the reality was, at that time for the events, we were testing the waters to figure out what people wanted, what they didn't want, and so we left the restrictions open to see what would come out. And Sean he's a very fun-loving player, and he's just like, well, to me, this is enjoyable, and now I know. To be fair, I actually faced that list, and I I saw the enjoyment and the fun factor
Yeah,
in it. I looked at it and I went, okay. It made it worse because our objective was actually kill points for that mission. And so I'm like, I literally have to engage with you in order to get points here. This isn't going to end particularly well. Tom's Polish Cavalry did a very similar thing, right? Yeah. And but we had a good time. We had a good ball. Sort of just he would throw a unit over a bridge or a hill or something, and I'd get the first one. I'd feel really good. And then two more units would come over the hill as well. I went, not feeling so good anymore. But anyway, that's more about, I guess, the unit type.
Yeah.
But it's sometimes you just have to deal with it. It's like, yes, there's a cost of how many points have been put into that unit.
Yeah.
But
the main point I was trying to bring up was the reaction to that one unit moving up.
Absolutely.
How many order dice and activations are going to go for that target?
Yep.
And what else you can do around the board.
That's right. And so that loops nicely in with dice advantage and pin management and all the other things that we sort of briefly talk about or in depth talk about. The idea of the best way to play bolt action from a pure efficiency point of view is to use the smallest number or none of your dice to impact, remove, or otherwise affect and force choices on as many of your opponent's dice as possible. Yeah. So classic examples of that are actually things like air observers and things like that, or artillery observers, where one of your activation dice may impact several of your opponents. So they're quite high. You only get it once, but it's a very high efficiency trade on that drop. But ultimately, this perpendicular attack, the idea of putting pressure on your opponent, giving them a threat, and it's happens in war games all over the place, right? Like 40k, back in 7th, and it's probably still now under 9th, but 6th and 7th edition, your opponent throws a Wraith Knight directly forward, just into your lines as quickly as possible. If they were really mean, they put invisibility on it. But it's that idea, right? It actually sometimes doesn't even matter how strong that unit is.
Yeah.
So how many times have I thrown my BA-64 car? It's like a 7+ to damage armored car. With a light machine gun. That's not really that much of a threat.
But if it draws the AT fire, your other stuff is free to move around, right?
I used it against... I was playing a game with Matt Castles one day, and I deliberately drove it and chased his commander. He was like, I know it's just a light machine gun, but this is so infuriating because he didn't want to lose his lieutenant. It was a victory point. And so I drove it across there as quickly as I could to put pressure on it, and immediately lined up the light machine gun and started firing and stuff. And Matt was just like, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that. Because
that's an excellent response to machine gun fire.
That's true.
And more so Matt. Like, he seems cool, calm, collected every time he's playing.
It's I surprised him a little bit on that one, I think, but he still spanked me. But but it's that sort of pressure, right? And because what you're trying to do, as well as break through the lines, as well as get good dice advantage, as well as causing damage on your opponent, your intent is to actually force pressure. Pressure forces mistakes. Mistakes can be exploited, and that's how you actually get the game flow running in your favor.
It's a great way to either neutralize dice advantage or gain.
Yes.
So that it's something that I did if I play like a 9 or 10 dice veteran list at 1,000 or 1,250 points.
Yep.
I will move quite a hefty veteran squad forward that might have a couple of BARs or something in cover, and most of the time people will spend 1 or 2 and maybe even 3 dice shooting at it. And then all I've done is I've maybe lost a couple of guys in that squad, maybe collected a pin or 2. But what I've done is I've now leveled the dice.
Yes.
The dice And when you're a veteran, or you're player,
that's what you need to do.
If you're playing a list with a veteran list and you're in a neutral dice advantage, you're actually
you got the advantage
you've got the upper hand because each one of your dice is now worth more.
Yep, absolutely. And so there's a few other angles of attack and stuff which we can go into, but this one is actually the simplest to talk about because it's so direct. It's just it's like, I guess, in the Napoleonic era, and having a cavalry charge come at your flank. It was so stock standard of a tactic, you knew it was going to happen. But you still had to devote resources to it to try and how how do we minimize our damage here? Do we do things differently? And and a whole bunch of stuff came out of that space, and it's no different in wargaming.
Yeah.
And the more that I start doing all this stuff out and like reviewing military history and whatever, I'm like, it's like literally, someone could go out there on a battlefield, modern day battlefield tactics and things that they would use. And if you think about it and then just apply that thinking into wargaming, it's actually surprising how much of that still comes across.
As general principles.
As general principles. As general principles.
Yeah.
And how much of it holds true because of the way the games are designed.
Yeah.
But that's probably it. I mean, unless you guys have any other questions, like I said, this one's pretty straightforward.
I mean, we're talking mostly about perpendicular here.
Yes,
We're talking about flanks and other things, but obviously all of them have pros and cons to the specific engagement at that point in time.
Yes.
But I think the thing that you're trying to articulate here is that a straightforward attack that's running right through the quickest point possible to the enemy isn't just to get your troops there quicker. It can cause the enemy to react and have to deal with that threat, giving you freedom with everything else.
Yeah. So I guess in a more proper formal kind of way, the reason that you would do a perpendicular attack is deliberately either A, because you know that you need to break it at that point to then get that exploitation time, or because you are trying to disrupt your opponent's battle plan.
Yeah.
You're trying to put a threat in a place where they can't ignore it and where they have to deal with it. There are several ways of doing it, but none of them are as obvious. So it's very good, very, very good at trying to bait your opponent into doing something. Yeah. Because you're putting troops forward, normally I would run them. I wouldn't advance them. I would normally, you put them in as much movement as possible up the board, and get them on track, and you sit there and go, yep, I'm going to be aggressive with it and force the issue.
One thing that I picked up, you're talking about earlier with the air observer, which seems really interesting to me, is that it's in a point that can see most of the board. And when you are that player and you're like, oh, this player isn't moving into line of sight, you feel bad because you want to clip that target with the airstrike, but it's doing its work.
Yes.
Yeah.
Being on the field, dictating those units to not move in line of sight. That's even just as good.
And that's.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's very commonly summed up within, I guess, the general concept of board control or area control. So when I go on to talk about observers and spotters and airstrike and all that stuff later, even multi-launchers to a degree, the real value is never in the kills.
Yeah.
The real value, although there's value there, the real value actually isn't even in the pins that it generates. They're nice. But the real value is the fact that you can, through a little bit of thinking and use of those orders, you can dictate where your opponent will and will not go with those dice. And so even when those dice, they're still in the bag, you still know that, okay, but for those 4 dice, I know they don't want to be anywhere near that marker, so they're going to either advance or run. Because there's something in front of them, they're only going to be able to advance 6, that's not going to be far enough away. So they're more likely to run, and they're going to run around. So you can start to predict where your opponent's going to go. You can start to predict where those units are probably going to end up. And you can start to then be able to look at the ones going, nah, he's snookered, that one can't be there. So I've used, as a little bit of a tangent, I've used the artillery strike on turn sort of 3 and turn 4 even, to protect the flank of my army from an outflanking attack.
Well, that was episode 6 of the Historical Miniature Gamers podcast. Check in for us again in, a fortnight we're going to meet up?
About a fortnight, we think.
Yep.
And we'll be talking about the next varsity event, the Wings of Glory Scramble, and some more bolt action tips and tricks. Jacob, Gorchin, and Dan.
And Dan.
See you next time.